Welcome, dear friends of Books and Voices of Revelation. Next, we have the narration of the following audiobook. They Got Married, and They Were Helpful, by Arnoldo Canclini. Third part. Victorious Resistance. Robert Moffat and Maria Smith. In 1821, a 16-year-old Scottish boy was bidding farewell to his parents, leaving for a somewhat distant city, where he was going in search of work. He was a gardener by profession, and in Cheshire, his destination, he had been offered a good job. As his family's financial needs were very great, he had to go despite the pain of his parents and siblings. As he said his last goodbye to his mother, she asked him to make a promise that he would never let a day go by without reading the Bible. That promise was what kept the young man in touch with his parents' faith, despite living in an environment where everything was blasphemies and vices. For years later, a couple friend convinced him to accompany them to a Methodist meeting and, overcoming the prejudices that were those of the majority, that these people were only a group of fanatics, he accepted and went. There he received the Lord as the master and savior of his life, and not long afterwards he decided to go as a missionary to Africa, where he left in 1816. But, in the meantime, other events occurred in his life, to which we will devote our attention. First of all, we will say that this young man was to become one of the most famous missionaries in Africa. His name was Robert Moffat. As he converted, he began to feel uncomfortable in his job and tried to change. He was fortunate that another gardener in the neighborhood, a very faithful believer, named Smith, offered him a job. There was Roberto, with all pleasure, when he was about 20 years old. One day, we don't know how, he had a surprise. We can imagine him bending over, with a hoe or shovel in his hand, working in the garden, when a voice greeted him behind him. He turned, returning the greeting, to find himself face to face with a beautiful young woman, who was about his age. It was Maria, the daughter of his master. Roberto felt within him that indescribable sensation that seems to say, "Here it is." He struck up a conversation with her. She was pious like her parents, and full of the same spirit of kindness that adorned them. Encounters like that were repeated over and over again. Both young men felt more and more united, both with each other and in Christian service, since both had the same aims, to be as useful as possible in the work of God. When he fearfully told her that he intended to go as a missionary, she happily replied that this was also her ideal. Everything united them, love for God and love for each other, and everything seemed to offer them a happy future. But when the decisive moment came, when he was about to leave, something happened that neither of them expected. Mr. Smith would not allow his daughter, his only daughter, his wife's companion, to go so far. There was no argument that could convince him, and Roberto was faced with the dilemma: marry Mary and stay there, or go to Africa and lose her, perhaps forever. He didn't hesitate for a moment. God was calling him and he went. We do not need the account of any witness or the confession of any of them to understand the brokenness of those loving hearts. But the assurance that God wanted him to do so tempered his pain. Arriving at the Cape of Good Hope, he marched north to the region where he was to work for a long series of years. In spite of Mr. Smith's emphatic refusal, he never lost sight of the possibility of bringing his beloved to the Cape to live with him. So, for 2.5 years, he continued to write letter after letter and continued to receive Mary's answers. In the first of these, she gave him some hope, but in the next two the opposite happened. So forceful had been her father's refusal that she had made herself aware that she would never be able to marry Roberto, knowing that he, no matter how much he loved her, would always put God's will first. Relating this sad news to his father, Moffat commented in a letter, "Of course I have been very dejected lately, but at the same time I have been able to love and trust in him who is nearer to me than a brother, and I have been led to see the changeability of all earthly good." He could not imagine, in the midst of his grief, that a few days before he wrote that letter, the attitude of Mary's parents had changed. Moved by the persistence of their daughter, in whom there was as much love for Robert as love for God, they had given their consent, although without losing the feeling of pain in the face of what they considered a definitive loss. She immediately wrote to her boyfriend's parents, telling him in these words, "My dear friends, no doubt you will be surprised to receive a letter from someone who is completely unknown to you, but though unknown in person, you are very dear to me because of your dear son Roberto. If you have received a letter from him lately, you may know what I mean to him, but as I think it is very probable that his letter has been lost, I cannot but be deeply anxious that you should know his happiness. I received letters from you 10 days ago, dated April and May, 1818, in the first of which he said that he was sending a letter to you at the same time, and also a letter to my father, but as this never came, I fear yours has suffered the same delay, if not altogether lost. It is not only the probability of such a circumstance that induces me to write to you, but also the desire to communicate to you that, after 2.5 years of the most painful anxiety, by the eternal mercy of God, I have obtained permission from my dear parents to go out next spring to join their beloved son in his arduous work. Such is what I did not expect in any way a week ago, but God's thoughts are not our thoughts. When he rises, all the mountains bow before him. He holds the hearts of all men in his hands, and he can turn them as the waters of rivers. This is what he has done with regard to my parents. Before the arrival of these last letters, my father had persisted in saying that I would never obtain his consent. My dear mother has likewise declared that it would break her heart, for I have no sisters and she is of advanced age. In spite of all that, yesterday they both calmly placed me in the Lord's hands, declaring that they would no longer try to hold me back. The thought of being separated forever from my beloved family seems too hard for me. Sometimes I think that I will not be able to begin the crossing of the ocean because the pain will bring me down, but my convictions about duty are such that I believe that if I were to stay one more year, then going would be beyond my means. Because I would be weighed down by the weight of an accusing conscience, when I consider Roberto's situation. Particularly painful, and the strong affection he shows for me. The last time he wrote to me he was very well, very happy with his work, but completely alone, often without seeing a white face. The people in general, the Namarquas, are very kind and have a lot of affection for him. When her parents made this decision, she was momentarily away from her home in Manchester. The letter he wrote to his mother in those circumstances, consoling her and showing her that it was all by the divine will, is remarkable. At the risk of being long, we will transcribe some excerpts. I can't feel anxiety in those moments. But you will have had no desire to recover what you have renounced. No, I trust that you will be more and more convinced of the appropriateness of your action. I cannot describe to you the secret pleasure it has given me to see both you and my dear father thus renouncing me in such a Christian manner. I always feared that if you gave up on me, it would be because of some kind of compulsion, but when I saw that they calmly declared that they realized that it was their duty and that they could not turn me any further away from the work of God, which has the right to claim anything, I could only exclaim, is this not the hand of God? What, outside of his divine power, could have led their spirits to something that was so opposite to them until now? And I trust that you will live to see abundant cause for rejoicing in what you have been moved to do. I dare say they won't lose out because of it. You must remember, my dear mother, that the Lord never deprives us of necessities, but is always ready to supply it by a still greater degree of his divine consolation, if we seek this in his hands and long to fill the empty space with his presence. And surely you will want to part with something earthly in order to have more of the consolations of the Spirit of God. For my own part, I have found it to be of the greatest value, for I have sometimes thought that I could bear to be separated from all earthly things that I needed if I could enjoy the divine presence in a degree proportionate to everything, as I have experienced in my last tribulations. It was decided that Mary should travel to the Cape with the Beck brothers, Dutch missionaries. Long was the farewell of his mother, a symbol of what would be his separation for all earthly life. Her father accompanied her to London, but he could not stay until the departure of the ship, so the young woman was left in the care of her friends. He wrote daily to his grieving mother. In the meantime, some difficulties had arisen in the area where Roberto was working, who had had to go to the Cape to find a solution for them. In this way, God wanted to prepare Mary for the best reception she could imagine, the presence of her future husband waiting for her. The emotion of that moment did not make her forget the pain of her parents, to whom she immediately wrote a letter to which Roberto added a few paragraphs. My dear parents, from this distant land, I sit this morning to write to you, as I have been told that today at 2 o'clock a ship leaves for England. Before I go any further, however, I must warn you not to expect me to write an interesting letter, as the change of scenery and circumstances that have come upon me have left my mind confused and agitated. I will begin by bearing witness to the goodness of the God who took me out of my father's house and brought me into this land of pagan darkness, to which my eyes and heart had been directed for so long. He has granted me delightful time throughout the journey, and through his presence he has bestowed upon me an ineffable calm and happiness since I embarked. Having separated myself from all of you, my affection feels uprooted from the world, and, as there is still uncertainty as to whether, on my arrival, I shall find my dear friend alive, I was prepared for anything. But, my cup of happiness seems almost full. Here I found him just as I could wish him in my heart, except that I was much agitated with anxiety, and the mere sight of him oppressed my heart. Our good friend Melville came to fetch me on board and took me to his house, where a scene took place which I do not trust one shall experience again. Each of us has received the other from God, and we are happy. Moffat will end this letter, and I shall soon write in more detail. Now my time is up and I can say nothing more. Mother, be happy, and praise God for my sake. Robert Moffat to Mr. and Mrs. Smith of Duckingfield. Dear Father and Mother, now, with even more reason than in my former letter, I can give you the beautiful title of fathers. It would be in vain for me to attempt to reproduce the different scenes through which I have passed, but more particularly what I felt when the news reached me that his beloved daughter had arrived. It was nothing less than coming to life from the dead. My prayers had been answered, the promises that had long been my refuge had been fulfilled. My prayers in this regard have been transformed into praise, and surely never in my life has the hand of God manifested itself for good in such a singular way. Mary, my dear Mary, is now far from a beloved earth, which is the place where she was born, and which is still enclosed by a circle of friends who are entwined around her heart, but more especially dear because it is the place of residence of you, loved above all things. Now she is separated from all these scenes and from you, but let us comfort you to know that, although in a foreign land, she is under the care of the omnipresent God and united to the one who speaks as she feels in promising that she will be the father, mother and husband of Mary, and that she will never forget the sacrifice you have made in entrusting the only daughter to her future care. December 27, 1819 was the long-awaited wedding day, which took place amidst the affection of the missionaries who lived in the city. Let us conclude with an excerpt from the letter she addressed a few days later to her brother John. There was an expression in my father's letter that made me a little sad, that in a sense I was dead to them. I think now that I should not be considered that way. Surely it must be a consolation to them that she is now united to a devoted servant of God, to whom her own life is not dear to her. They may know of me, and I trust that they will come to know that I am of some use in this world. Is it not better to be a helper to those who are working, than to lie in the grave having done nothing for the building of the temple? I trust that you will assist in removing this impression. It cheers their hearts and always dispels any melancholy fears about me. I can assure you that every possible provision has been made for my convenience, and the government delegate gives Moffat every kind of facility. At the same time, I hope to always be reasonable in my hopes and courageous in bearing the cross. Before I bade farewell to my home, I had already calculated for myself a life of toils, shames, and reproaches, and now my soul can welcome them for Christ's sake. The end. End of this third part.